Hello and happy 20th of December. I have dedicated this episode to all the scary stuff about Christmas, because Christmas was a very scary and dangerous holiday. Much to do about the darkness, because it was very dark. You have to remember that people lived scattered around the countryside. There were no electric lights. It was pitch dark if they didn't bring a light. Of course, if it was a moon or the northern lights, it would light up the surroundings, but otherwise it was pitch dark. And people weren't really that afraid of the dark, because then they couldn't really go out in the wintertime, and that would be very unpractical. And they never taught their children to be scared of the dark as well on an everyday basis, but for Christmas, because Christmas is a holiday. It's out of the ordinary. And if you go through, well, most civilization, you will find that when things are out of the ordinary, when you have sort of a rite of passage, you have a liminal phase where you're very vulnerable to whatever. So you can say that Christmas was that liminal phase. You had everything that built up to Christmas, and then you had Christmas, and then you had New Year's, and everything went back to the ordinary. And in between there, you had to take care. It was dangerous. But what they were most afraid of was something called Oskoreia. And this was sort of a big parade of, well, mostly dead people. And it was the ghosts that was the most threatening about Christmas. But these were sort of undead. They hadn't found any peace. They were criminals. They were unchristian children born out of wedlock. It was all the terrible ghosts that were not, they would not have been buried in sacred ground, and therefore they would haunt the world forever. And these came in packs, and they were riding like ghost horses and swept over the countryside. And you could do things to prevent them from coming to your farm. When you had cleaned your home, and you had cleaned yourself and put on clean clothes, and everything was ready for Christmas, they would go out. And usually Christmas was started by the ringing of the church bells. But since people lived so far, people had a day's travel to get to the church. They wouldn't hear the ringing of the bells, so they would shoot. Well, after they got a fire weapon, and they would go outside and shoot in all directions, like north, east, south, and west. And that would scare evil spirits away. They would also put crosses above their doors, like in soot, like I've told you earlier. They would put steel in all the cribs for the small children. They could wear silver. For the horses, they would burn gunpowder on their backs. Sounds very hazardous. So they had different steps to prevent Oskoreia from coming to their farm. They also took in everything that they had outside that was loose, because if something was not tied down or nailed to the wall, they would take it and just throw it around. And if they got you, they didn't take you away like physically, they took your soul. And if you were taken and you sort of noticed it right away, you could either cross yourself or you could curse and they would let you go. But this was they went for everyone, from the old ones, the young ones, and especially the small children, because they were so vulnerable. And also that is why you would baptize your children right away, within the first week, because when you were not baptized, you were very, very vulnerable to all, well, superstitious creatures. So Oskoreia was the most dangerous one, and usually it came the night before Christmas, or Christmas Eve, and the night before the first Christmas day, as we say here in Norway. They were a terrible, terrible bunch, and it's especially in Telemark that these stories are from, and further south. Not a lot of them from the north. Maybe they had other people that came, but at least in the southern part of Norway, Oskoreia was something people were very afraid of. They also believed that the dead had a midnight mass on Christmas Eve, and you should not disturb them. But if you met some, you could ask them if they could tell you who would be sick and die of your friends and family within the next year. It was a hazardous thing to do, because they could take your soul, but if you crossed yourself and did all these things, you could take signs from them. And it was a very dangerous time, but it was also a very happy time, because Christmas was a time for celebrations. A lot of people got married during Christmas, actually, because it was a time when you don't had so much else to do, because the weddings were huge and you invited like all your friends and family and their friends and family too, so you could easily have 200 guests in your wedding, and so you needed to do that when people didn't have a lot else going on, like work on their farms. So for Christmas they didn't work almost for 3 weeks. They just had to feed their animals and water them, and otherwise they didn't have anything to do because it was so dark. So it was also a joyous time, and it was a time for taking signs on how the next year would be. And you could take signs on who would get sick, who would die. You could take signs on who would get married and have children. And you can also do the practical things like, will my crops be good? Where can I find the most fish? All sorts of signs, and they had different ways of taking these signs. And it also varies around Norway, region to region, have different ways of taking signs and analyzing them. So it is a very, very interesting time of year, and it shows a lot about what people believed, what they were afraid of, what brought them joy, how life was, and I think for them back then it was a very nice sort of break from everyday life, because their everyday life was really the same every day, every year. It was not a lot of differences like we do and travel and do all sorts of stuff, they did the same thing every day, day in, day out, all year round, all their lives. So every break from that routine was welcome. I hope you enjoyed this. It took a long time. And tomorrow will be the 21st and Thomas Mass.